So my presentation this morning is entitled Not the Sum of Its Parts, or what does holism mean in a product-centric world? Another title that I could have given it, I realized after I finished creating the slides, was I could have called it Camels, Cartwheels and Igloos, because I'm going to talk about all those things at various different points. This follows on quite nicely, actually, from what Brianna was talking about. I was very interested to hear what she said about the value stream orientation that she's working towards, because what I want to talk about is this shift towards product orientation, or rather, I want to talk about what business analysts need to do within the context of this shift towards a product orientation that's happening at the moment. That there is definitely a change happening. You know, more business analysts are working in a product environment than they used to. It used to be that we all worked on projects. So I was very interested to see when IIBA earlier this year introduced their new certification, the certificate in product ownership analysis. So I was one of the early adopters of that, and that has got me thinking quite a lot about how do business analysts need to change the way they think in a product-oriented situation. What are the particular strengths that business analysts bring to this, and are there any ways in which we need to change? And thinking about products, there's one key concept that keeps coming up when business analysts talk about what they do, that I realized I think that we want to slightly adjust the way we think about it. And this is this idea of holism. We often talk about a holistic approach to business analysis. A holistic approach. It's from the Greek word holos, meaning whole. It's about considering the whole thing. It's closely related to the idea of a system. Everything that we work on is a system, whether it's an information technology system, a computerized system, or whether it's a business system consisting of people and processes, or whether it's a product, a digital product or a non-digital product. We can think about all of them as systems, and what they've all got in common is that they're made up of elements, and there are connections, relationships, dependencies between those different elements, and that's what makes up a system. I was interested to find this definition of the word holistic in the dictionary. It's got two parts. Firstly, emphasizing the importance of the whole and the interdependence of the parts, and secondly, concerned with wholes rather than analysis or separation into parts. And when we talk about taking a holistic approach to business analysis, I think we're focusing normally very much on this aspect. It's the aspect of the interdependence of the parts. We look at the individual parts that go to make up the system and the interdependencies between them. The danger with that is when we think we're looking at the interdependencies between the parts, we end up kind of just looking at those parts themselves. So what we're actually doing is we're focusing on the parts again rather than on the whole. Classic example of this is Leavitt's diamond. You may have seen this somewhere in the past. This was a concept that Harold Leavitt came up with back in the 1950s. In a business or a business system, there are all these elements that interrelate with each other. There's the people involved in the situation. There is the organizational structure which has a bearing on the system. There are the processes and tasks that need to be carried out and that are being carried out. And there's the technology as well. And these things all interrelate with each other. And probably more likely that you've come across the Poppets model that's presented in the business analysis book by Deborah Paul, who hopefully you heard speaking yesterday. Very similar model. But when we start using these models to look at a situation, as I say, we tend to start looking at the individual parts again, and we start taking our focus off the whole thing. We have this tendency as business analysts to atomize things, consider them as collections of individual items. And indeed, when we think about requirements, we are actually taught that requirements must be atomic, aren't we? Each requirement should not overlap with any other requirements. Each requirement should describe one thing only. So we have this tendency to atomize things, and we think about the function of those individual components, the value of those individual components, sometimes regardless of whether they all fit together in order to display something that is harmonious or something that is in proportion. But when we're thinking about a product, that's not satisfactory. When we're thinking about a product, we need to be thinking about something that does fit together. We need to be thinking about its proportions, its harmony as a thing, whether that's a digital product that you can see or a physical product that is designed, or whether it's actually a business system. The same considerations apply. We need to think about it as a whole. So making the requirements atomic is fine, and it's useful because it helps us to identify the value of each of the requirements. But we can't necessarily then use that as a basis for design. So it's very important to make that step from determining what the business requirements are to getting into a design frame of mind where we are actually saying, okay, now let's think about this system, whatever kind of system it is. Now let's think about it as something that we've got to design. And I think requirements catalogs don't necessarily help with that, because they do encourage this sort of atomized view. You can see on the right hand side of the slide here, that is a real requirements catalog that I've worked with in the past. I've made it small so that you can't read the requirements, and also that it will fit on the slide. But you can see it's just a list, and a requirements catalog being just a list, it doesn't have a shape. It doesn't have a shape. There's nothing attractive about it. There's no, when you look at it, you can't see any dynamism in there. You can't see any tensions in there. Whereas in a real systems are all about dynamics. They're all about tension. The structure of a list doesn't reflect the shape of the problem. It doesn't tell you anything about the shape of the problem, and it doesn't tell you anything about the shape of the solution either. Frankly, they're boring, and if you've ever sat in a day-long review meeting for a requirements catalog, you probably agree with me. There's normally far too much detail in a requirements catalog for it to be easy for people to understand. And there's usually too little detail for them to be genuinely rigorous. I think that requirements catalogs are most useful if we keep them to the high-level business requirements. But that's rarely what happens in my experience. They normally dive down into a greater level of detail. And then of course we have all this activity that we do around categorizing the requirements, which I don't always find very helpful. So we have these long meetings where we're going through long lists of things, and that's not a good way of approaching design. you can end up with something like this if you take that approach to design. Little unfair on camels. I mean, I think camels are probably beautiful animals, but it's something that people say, isn't it? That a camel is a horse designed by a committee. So this is what requirements catalogs make me think of. And another thing that we talk about is gap analysis. Gap analysis, I always think, is an interesting concept. It's a favorite concept of a lot of business analysts. This is a picture that I got off the internet somewhere. And the point I'm making here is that if you do analyze a problem into its tiny constituent parts, if you then proceed directly from that list of tiny constituent parts to actually trying to design something, you may end up with something like this vehicle on the left. It's a monstrosity, it's a chimera, it's just made up of lots of different things put together. It's a bit like Dr. Frankenstein's monster. Whereas what you want to aim for is something like the vehicle on the right, which is a coherent vision. It's been designed with focus. It's been designed with an idea of what it should be like, what its shape should be. So I always think it's a funny thing to try analyzing a gap. Here's a gap between two sides of a river, and the way I think about it is, you don't close a gap, you don't bridge a gap by analyzing it. You close a gap by building something, by building a bridge over it. So you need to think in a constructive way, a creative way, a designerly way about that. Once you know what the requirements are, once you know what the business objectives are, of course, everything we do should be driven by the business case. That's why we're business analysts. But to my mind, the gap that worries me is the creativity gap, because I often see systems that do seem to have been designed kind of by accident. People have identified what the requirements are, and then they've somehow just built something based on those business requirements, but they haven't been through that intermediate stage of really thinking creatively about the design. And that's where the holistic thinking comes in again. We need, rather than just analysis, we need synthesis. We need to design. We need a truly holistic approach. So we need to think about these other parts of the definition. So it's about emphasizing the importance of the whole and looking at the whole thing, rather than analyzing and separating it into parts. So this second part of this dictionary definition actually makes a contrast between analysis and being concerned with whole. So by definition, analysis, or on one definition, analysis is about splitting something up into little parts. So yeah, it's great. It's a great and important thing that we do, splitting things up into parts, because that's how you understand them. But then when you're going to put something new together, you need to start thinking about the whole. And the importance of the whole in particular is that is what people perceive. The people who are going to be using your system, the people who are going to be interacting with your system in any way, they will perceive it as a whole. They will react to it as a whole. Their experience of it is one thing, really. And the key concept here is this idea of Gestalt. It's a German word. It means literally shape or form or image or figure or character. But it's the name of a school of psychology originating around about 100 years ago in Germany and Austria. And it, as it says on the slide, it has the sense that meaning cannot be found from breaking things down into parts, but rather from an appreciation of the whole. And this is where the saying, something is more than the sum of its parts, comes from. It's from the pioneers of the Gestalt movement in psychology. What they actually said was, they didn't say a system is more than the sum of its parts. They said a system is not the sum of its parts, and it might be more and it might be less. And it's how well you do the design that determines whether it's more than the sum of its parts or less than the sum of its parts. That's the difference that design can make. Gestalt is very much about seeing things. People are very, very visual. There's a lot of principles in Gestalt psychology about how we perceive a whole thing, even when all we can see is parts. So that's the significance of this little shape that you can see on the slide. You can see a white square there, but there isn't a white square there. But we see the white square and we react to that, and that's the way that people work. So people's brains are hardwired to perceive structure in their experiences. They perceive symmetry in their experiences. They perceive harmony in their experiences, and when they perceive asymmetry, lack of symmetry, they notice it straight away. We're very sensitive to lack of symmetry, and it offends us. We don't like it. Maybe that's why children are always complaining about things not being fair, because it offends their lack of symmetry. And it's interesting that I think what business analysts have to do has a parallel in the work of a very well-known influential architect called Christopher Alexander, who's been around for several decades. He's written some very influential books. The first influential book he wrote in the 1960s was Notes on the Synthesis of Form. And in there, he tries to define a really scientific, mathematically based method for coming up with the form of a building or a town, based initially on requirements, a list of requirements. So what you can see there in the second photo there from my book that I took with my phone is a list of requirements for a village. This is for a village in India, and then he writes down all the different requirements, and then what he does is he identifies all the dependencies between the requirements in this very systematic way. And then in the right-hand picture, you can see there's a lot of very sophisticated looking mathematics, which I don't understand, which is actually it's a rigorous method for proceeding from requirements to coming up with the shape of the building. Now, this was an incredibly influential book, really important, but what people found was this method doesn't work. It doesn't work. No one uses this method anymore, including Christopher Alexander. He found out pretty much straight away. And he's produced some wonderful buildings, and people, followers of his have produced some wonderful buildings, but they didn't do it by following this approach. They did it by taking a much more designerly approach and thinking about the whole thing. So I think that we need to learn from that as business analysts, and say, yes, it's good to itemize all these requirements. It's good to think about their dependencies. But then we need to think about the whole thing. We need to think about the gestalt of what we're building. And there's lots of examples that we can be inspired by, that we see out there. One thing, this is where the igloos come in. Something that's well designed needs to fit in with its environment. It needs to fit in with the people who are using it. It needs to fit in with the physical environment and the whole context. So an igloo is a great example, because the building materials, well, it's snow, and the people that build Eskimos, build igloos, Eskimos, they've got a lot of snow. It doesn't require any fixtures and fittings. You don't need screws and bolts and things. You can fit it together by hand, as long as you've got a knife to cut the snow into blocks. And it just so happens that the shape of the igloo is exactly the right shape to minimize transfer of heat out of the igloo into the external environment. So it's a perfect harmony between the environment the people using it, and the actual functional requirements. So that's a great example. And this has evolved over a long period. It's evolved by trial and error, really. Another great example that's discussed in the design literature is the traditional English cart, specifically cart wheels, the wheels on the traditional English cart. I don't know how clearly you can see in the picture that the shape of the wheels is very interesting. They're not flat. If you looked at it from the back, you would see they curve outwards. They're shaped like a saucer or a dish, and this phenomenon is called dishing of the wheels. And the interesting thing about this is no one's quite sure why they are dished or how it came about, but it has lots of advantages. It means that it makes the turning circle of the cart smaller. It means that you can have this shape of the actual body of the cart that leans outwards, so you can get more stuff into it. And it also is very good at withstanding the lateral forces that are imposed on the wheel by being pulled by a horse along a road for a long period of time, or along a path, because that creates forces going from side to side as the horse moves. So it solves all these problems, and it solves them all simultaneously. So it meets the needs of the user, it meets the needs of the functional requirements, and it fits in with the environment. And again, it's evolved via trial and error over a very long period. And I think in common with the igloo, I would say it's beautiful. It's a beautiful form. It's a form that you look at and you feel good looking at it. And I would like to think that when I design something, people feel good looking at it, although I don't know if that's always the case. So you, as a business analyst, you're a designer, I'm a designer, we're all designers of some sort, because we're all doing things which are about putting components together in a meaningful way. So what's going to help us to do this? One thing is constraints. We need to have constraints on our design solution. The bigger the constraint, the easier it is to come up with a good design. We need to, one particular type of constraint is guiding principles for our design. Guiding principles, what people sometimes refer to as a North Star for your design. You can focus on a specific concrete idea, create a design concept based on it, and see where that takes you. Learn from it, throw it away, and try again. So you can see what I'm moving towards here is saying that a product orientation involves iterative development, and it involves user-centered development. And those are absolutely key to my way of thinking. Great example of failing to do that was the Ford Edsel. I used to think the Ford Edsel was one model of car, but it turns out when I looked into it, it was actually an entire new division that the Ford Motor Company created in about 1956, I think. They invested a huge amount of money in it. They designed all these new cars. But they didn't bother to test the cars. They didn't bother to do any user testing or market testing. They were just sure that they had designed some really great cars. And whether you think that this car looks nice in this picture or not, I don't know. I mean, it's got something going for it, just like a camel's got something going for it. But anyway, the Edsel division for Ford was a disaster. They basically had to write off $250 million. And this was in 1960. So that's more than $2 billion in today's money. Because they didn't think about, would this actually work for people? They just created a product. So being product focused doesn't mean just focusing on the product and nothing else. It means focusing on the product and the users and the environment. One of the intriguing things about this particular Edsel model is this is the station wagon, the Edsel station wagon. And these are the indicator lights, these arrow-shaped things at the back. But it turned out that when people drove it, and if it was dark or foggy, or the visibility wasn't so good, or if you're a long way away from the car, when the left-hand indicator light came on, what the person behind would see would be an arrow pointing to the right. And when the right-hand indicator light came on, the person behind would see an arrow pointing to the left. So it turned out that was really not a very good idea, and it did not have good consequences. So I think we need to try to avoid that type of thing happening. And we know how to do that. We know how to avoid that happening. We need to use people-oriented design. I'm not going to talk through all the different elements of this process because we don't have time. But it's my process for doing people-oriented design, for creating things that are based on an understanding of the users, their physical context, their social context, their technical context, the problems that they have, the solutions we might create for them, which will help them to achieve their goals within that context. And the key thing is iterative. Just like all those generations and generations of Eskimos who came up with the igloo, and the generations of cartwrights who or wheelwrights who developed the form of the cartwheel. We can emulate that learning process by using agile development or iterative development, and producing multiple design concepts and trying them out, getting real users to really use them, and seeing if they work, and learning, filtering the things that we've learned, and making design decisions based on that. So lots more I'd love to say here, but I've taken up lots of your time already, so thank you very, very much for listening. Really always very interested to hear from people, so do get in touch with your thoughts, and I look forward to hearing any questions that we have afterwards.